The December cold hit me the moment I stepped out of my car onto my parents' driveway. I could see the glow of Christmas lights through the living room window, warm and golden, the kind of light that promises belonging. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the air, holding the pecan pie I had baked that morning, and I told myself this year would be different. I told myself that every year, my sister's Range Rover was already parked by the garage. Of course it was. She lived 40 minutes away and somehow always arrived before me, even though I only lived 12. My mother had a way of calling her first, reminding her twice, saving her the seat closest to the fireplace. These were the small things I had spent years pretending not to notice. I knocked before using my key, which I always did because one Christmas 3 years ago I had walked in unannounced and my mother had looked at me with a flash of something close to annoyance before rearranging her face into a smile. I had never forgotten that look. I knocked now. "She's here," I heard my mother call out, not quite warmly, the way you announce a delivery rather than a daughter. The house smelled like cinnamon, and the expensive candles my sister always brought. My niece and nephew ran past me without stopping, already wound up on Christmas energy. My brother-in-law stood near the kitchen island, glass of wine in hand, nodding at me the way men nod at people they tolerate. "You made it," my sister said from the couch, and she smiled the smile that had always made me feel like a guest in my own family. I set the pie on the counter. My mother glanced at it and turned back to stirring something on the stove. We ate. We talked about my sister's kitchen renovation, about my brother-in-law's promotion, about my niece's dance recital. When my father asked how my job was going, I said fine, and he nodded and moved on. I was a legal assistant at a small firm in Charlotte. I had been there 4 years. It paid the bills and gave me good health insurance, and that was, in my family's estimation, the ceiling of my ambition. My sister had married a man who worked in commercial real estate. They lived in a house with a mudroom and heated floors. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a noisy upstairs neighbor and a parking spot I shared with a stranger. These were the facts of our lives, and my family treated them as evidence of something fundamental, as though my sister had simply wanted more, and I had not. After dinner, my parents brought out the gifts. My sister received a 7-night cruise for 4 through the Caribbean. My mother slid the envelope across the table with both hands, the way you present something precious. My sister pressed her palm to her mouth. My brother-in-law laughed and pulled her into a hug. The kids cheered. My father beamed in a way I had not seen him beam in years. Then my mother handed me an envelope. Inside was a Visa gift card, $100. The kind you buy at a grocery store checkout, still in its paper sleeve, with a little bow sticker pressed crooked on the front. I looked at it for a moment. The cruise package, I would later find out, had cost just over $11,000. I knew this because my mother mentioned the price twice during the dinner conversation, glowing with the telling of it. "Something small," my mother said to me with a shrug that was almost apologetic, "since you're still getting on your feet." I had been on my feet for 7 years. I paid my own rent, my own car note, my own student loans. I had never asked them for a single dollar. But in my family's accounting, stable and invisible added up to the same thing as struggling, and I had learned that arguing the math only made me seem ungrateful. "Thank you," I said. I drove home that night with the gift card in my coat pocket and the specific kind of tired that comes not from doing too much but from pretending too long. I did not cry. I had stopped crying about my family years ago. What I felt instead was a quiet, clarifying thing, like fog finally lifting off a road you've been driving blind. I did not know yet what was coming. I did not know that the night I was sitting in my parents' living room watching my sister open an $11,000 envelope, a letter was sitting in my apartment mailbox that would change every calculation. I found it the next morning. It was from a law firm in Asheville. Formal letterhead, certified mail sticker on the outside. My grandmother had passed away 4 months earlier. She had been 91, sharp until the end, and she had lived her whole life in the same 3-bedroom house in the Montford neighborhood of Asheville, in a part of the city that had quietly transformed around her over the decades into something valuable. I had visited her every few weeks, even when the drive was tiring, even when my family didn't ask where I was going. She made sweet tea and asked me real questions and remembered the answers. She was the only person in my family who had ever told me she was proud of me without a qualifier attached. The letter told me I was the sole beneficiary of her estate. I sat down on my kitchen floor, still in my coat, and read it twice. The estate included the Montford house, which had been appraised at just over $800,000. It included a savings account, a modest investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy. Combined, the total came to approximately $1.4 million. There was a handwritten note from the attorney at the bottom of the letter, personal stationery tucked inside. She said my grandmother had updated her will 3 years ago. She had been deliberate. She had told the attorney that she wanted me to have time to build something real and that she trusted me to know what to do with it. I sat on my floor for a long time. Then I did the most important thing I would do in the entire sequence of events that followed. I did not call my parents. I did not call my sister. I called the attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had known my grandmother for 22 years. We spoke for over an hour that first conversation. She explained the probate process, the timeline, what I needed to bring to her office. She also said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Your grandmother was very specific about one thing. She said when the time came, move carefully and move quietly. She seemed to know there might be pressure. My grandmother had known her family." I drove to Asheville 3 days after Christmas. I sat in Patricia's office with a yellow legal pad and took notes. The house would need to go through probate, which would take time. The financial accounts were structured to transfer more directly. Patricia helped me understand every step, and at the end of our meeting she referred me to an estate planning attorney in Charlotte who specialized in asset protection. Within 2 weeks, I had a trust established. I had signed documents. I had a plan. Nobody in my family knew any of it. My grandmother's house sat on a quiet street lined with old trees. The neighbors had known her for decades. Patricia had already spoken with them gently about the situation, explaining that the estate was in process, that the new owner would be in touch. I drove past the house twice before I had the courage to go inside. The third time, I walked through the front door with a spare key Patricia had given me, and I sat in my grandmother's living room in the same chair she always sat in, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what she had done for me. She had done it quietly, over years, because that was how she did everything. She had never mentioned money when we sat together. She had just asked me questions and listened to my answers and poured more tea. In February, my sister called me. She had heard something, she said. A friend of a friend who knew someone in Asheville. Her voice was careful in the way my sister's voice only got when she wanted something and was deciding how to ask. "Is it true Grandma left you something?" she asked. I had prepared for this moment. Patricia had prepared me for this moment. "The estate is still in probate," I said, which was technically true. "But she left everything to you?" Her careful voice had slipped into something tighter. "That doesn't seem right. She had 4 grandchildren. I really can't talk about it while it's in probate," I said. "You should probably have your own attorney look into anything you think you're entitled to." She was quiet for a long time. "I'll talk to Mom and Dad," she said, and hung up. The call from my mother came 2 hours later. My mother did not do careful voices. My mother went directly to the version of herself she became when she believed she had been wronged, which was loud and certain and not interested in the other person's words. She said it wasn't fair. She said my grandmother had been confused at the end. She said that she, my mother, had been the one to handle things, the one who managed the paperwork when Grandma needed help, the one who drove up to Asheville when there were appointments. She said I had no idea what the family had invested. I listened. What I knew, and did not say, was that my grandmother had been sharp until her last month. What I knew was that Patricia had been present for every significant conversation, had documented everything, had ensured the will was sound and witnessed and dated correctly. What I knew was that the driving my mother mentioned, those 3 or 4 trips to Asheville over the last 2 years of my grandmother's life, had been followed each time by my mother asking my grandmother whether she'd thought about what would happen to the house. My grandmother had thought about it. Very carefully. For 3 years before anyone started asking. "I think you should speak with an attorney if you have concerns," I said. My mother told me I was being cold. She told me family didn't talk to family like this. She told me she didn't raise me to be this way. I said I loved her and ended the call. In March, something arrived in my apartment mail that I was not expecting. My bank sent a fraud alert. Someone had attempted to access my checking account using a password reset tied to my mother's email address. The attempt had failed because I had two-factor authentication enabled, something I had set up after a conversation with Patricia's assistant about protecting myself during this period. I called the bank. I filed a report. I changed every password I had, every account, everything. A week later, I discovered that someone had signed up for a credit card in my name, using my social security number and an old address, the address of my parents' home where I had lived until I was 22. The application had been declined because my credit profile didn't match, but it had been attempted. I called Patricia. Then I called a separate attorney in Charlotte who handled identity theft and civil matters. Then I called the police and filed a report. I had names. I had IP addresses the bank provided. I had a pattern. My brother-in-law's name appeared in the investigation's early findings. He had done something similar once before, a civil matter in another state from 8 years ago, before he had married my sister. A creditor dispute that had been settled quietly. I did not confront anyone. I let the attorneys handle it. In April, my parents called a family meeting. They used that phrase, a family meeting, as though we were still sitting around the kitchen table working out chore schedules. They called my phone 4 times in one day. My sister texted 17 times. My brother-in-law sent one email that was 3 paragraphs long and cited a legal concept he had clearly just read about, incorrectly. I did not go to the family meeting. Instead, I was in Asheville that weekend. The probate had finalized. Patricia stood beside me in the Montford house while the paperwork was completed. And then I sat in my grandmother's chair again and looked out at the same trees my grandmother had looked at for 40 years, and I felt something settle inside me that I had not known was unsettled. The house needed work. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the early 90s. The bathrooms were dated. But the bones were beautiful, the ceilings high, the light coming through the old windows in that particular warm way that newer construction never quite replicates. Patricia told me the rental market in Montford was strong. A restored house on this street could generate meaningful income. I had already spoken with a contractor. My mother called again in May. Her tone had changed. The loudness was still there, but underneath it was something worn, something that recognized the conversation wasn't going the way she had expected. She said she was sorry about the gift card at Christmas. She said she hadn't realized how it looked. She said she hoped I knew that she loved me. I told her I knew she loved me. I believed that was true, in the way that certain truths can exist alongside other truths that are also real and damaging. I said, "Mom, an identity theft investigation is currently active. I need you to understand that I am aware of what happened, and the relevant authorities are aware of what happened. I'm not going to discuss the estate further. My attorneys will handle anything legal." There was a long silence. "We just needed to know if the family could be helped," she said, quietly. "You've always been helped by people you didn't see clearly," I said. "That's different from needing." She didn't answer. My sister called that same evening. Her voice was flat, stripped of performance. "Are you really going to do this?" she said. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "I'm doing something for myself." She was our grandmother too. She was, I said. And she made her own choices with her own things. I didn't ask her for any of it. I just showed up. That's all I ever did. I just showed up. My sister was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. She said, "I know." Just that. 2 words, and I heard in them something that might have been the closest she was capable of coming to an acknowledgement. I didn't push it. I didn't need the confession. I just needed to not be standing in my parents' driveway holding a pecan pie and pretending the $100 gift card felt like anything other than what it was. "Take care of yourself," I said, and I meant it, and I ended the call. The identity theft case was settled civilly. My brother-in-law signed an agreement. My family was advised by their attorney to cease all contact regarding the estate. They did. I heard from my mother on my birthday, a short text. I heard from my sister at Thanksgiving, a photo of the kids. I responded to both. I was not cruel. I was not cold. I was simply finished with the version of myself that had stood at their door and knocked instead of using her own key. The Montford house renovation was completed in October. I stood in the restored kitchen with new white cabinets and the original hardwood floors refinished to a warm honey color, and I took a photo and sent it to no one, because it was mine, and it didn't need an audience. I kept my apartment in Charlotte. I kept my job at the firm, though I had enrolled part-time in a paralegal certification program that would eventually move me into a better position. I was not reckless with what I had been given. I set aside a fund for my niece and nephew, held in trust, accessible when they turned 25, structured so that their parents could not touch it. My grandmother would have approved of that. Patricia retired the following spring. At her retirement dinner, which I attended as a guest, she introduced me to her colleagues as one of the most prepared clients I've ever worked with. I think what she meant was that I had done exactly what my grandmother had known I would do. I had been quiet. I had been careful. I had moved slowly and watched where I was stepping. There is a version of this story where I confronted my family in a dramatic scene and said everything I had stored up over 30 years of Christmas dinners and birthday phone calls that came a day late, and conversations that moved past me, to the person beside me. I used to imagine that version. I used to think the confrontation was where the satisfaction lived. It doesn't live there. It lives in the ordinary Tuesday morning when I drove up to Asheville to check on the house and let myself in with my own key and made coffee in my grandmother's kitchen and sat in her chair and listened to the trees outside go quiet in the cold, and I thought about how she had done the most powerful thing a person can do for someone they love. She had paid attention. She had seen me clearly, for years, without making a production of it. She had not waited for me to prove myself to an audience. She had simply, steadily, kept her eyes open. The $100 gift card from my mother is in a drawer in my Charlotte apartment. I kept it, not as a reminder of anything bitter. I kept it because there was a night in December when I drove home alone with that card in my coat pocket, and I made a decision on that drive. A quiet one, to stop arranging my life around people who couldn't see it clearly. That decision turned out to be worth more than I had any way of knowing at the time. My grandmother knew, though. I think that's why she did it the way she did. Not to punish anyone, not to make a point, just to make sure that when the moment came, I would have something solid under my feet. She had seen me. For 30 years, at least once a week. In a house on a quiet street in Asheville, she had poured sweet tea and asked me questions, and listened to every answer. That was the real inheritance. Everything else was just the house.